Welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're diving into a study that completely blew my mind. We're talking about a fundamental biological mystery of human existence. How is a memory actually, physically formed inside your brain? I mean, think about it. Every single thing you learn, every experience you remember, happens right there in that organ. But how does the physical, wet tissue of the brain create the invisible, electrical world of a memory? Today, we're looking at a groundbreaking study that finally uncovers the missing link between the physical and the electrical.
It really all comes down to this one core question. How does our genetic hardware actually code for the electrical software of our memories? For decades, we've understood that memory is an electrical process, but we haven't known exactly how our DNA strings the whole shebang together. Like, how do the genes we're born with dictate the brain waves that store our most precious memories? Well, neuroscience might finally have the answer.
So here's a quick roadmap for this explainer. 1. The memory mystery. 2. Mapping brainwaves. 3. Connecting waves to genes. 4. Decoding the memory genes. And finally, 5. The future of memory. We're going to break this all down step by step.
All right, let's jump straight into section 1. The memory mystery, the biological black box. See, we've known for a long time where memory happens electrically in the brain, but the black box has always been which specific genes make it possible. Okay, let's dive into this. Historically, neuroscience has kind of been divided into two completely different worlds that honestly rarely talk to each other. On one side, you have the brain's software. These are the brain oscillations, the alpha, beta, and gamma waves you've probably heard of. This is the electrical activity firing off when you think or remember something. On the flip side, you have the brain's hardware, your DNA, your genes, the actual physical ion channels inside your cells. What's absolutely incredible about the study we're looking at today is that scientists are finally building a bridge between these two completely separate worlds. Which brings us to section 2, mapping brainwaves, catching memory in the act. Because, obviously, to find the genetic link to memory, researchers first had to map out the exact electrical patterns of a memory being created, right? In real time. To pull this off, they used a technique called IEEG, or intracranial electroencephalography. Now, this isn't just a simple cap you wear on your head. This involves placing electrodes directly onto the surface of the human brain. By doing this with 66 patients who were fully awake and actively performing tasks, researchers were able to record electrical activity across the neocortex with just incredible, absolute precision. So here's exactly how the experiment played out. The patients were asked to memorize a list of 15 simple words, things like cloud, axe, or farm. Then, immediately after, they were forced to do math. Because, scientists love throwing addition at you right when you're trying to concentrate. This served as a distractor to essentially wipe their short-term memory. Finally, they were given 30 seconds to recall as many of those original words as they could. And the whole time they were doing this, those electrodes were recording everything. And that brings us to a really crucial concept, SME, or the subsequent memory effect. Since researchers knew exactly which words a patient remembered and which ones they completely forgot, they could calculate the literal electrical difference between a word that stuck and a word that just vanished into thin air. By figuring out this SME, scientists were able to isolate the exact precise electrical signature of a successfully created memory. All right, on to section 3, connecting waves to genes, crashing two worlds together. This is the part where researchers took those highly specific SME brainwave signatures and compared them directly to post-mortem human brain RNA expression data that was collected across 14 different cortical regions. Now, when I first read this next part, I was floored. Out of more than 12,000 expressed genes analyzed across the human brain, they found that exactly 163 distinct genes perfectly correlated with those memory encoding brainwaves. Just 163 genes out of over 12,000. Now, what's really interesting about this data is how those 163 genes actually break down across the different brainwave frequencies. Take a look at the beta band, right in the middle there at 16 to 20 hertz. A staggering 98 genes are correlated with it. That means a whopping 61% of these memory-related genes correlated specifically with beta oscillations. This tells us, for sure, that beta waves are incredibly important when it comes to information processing and memory in the cortex. Moving on to section 4, decoding the memory genes, the suspect profile. So, we've got our super exclusive list of 163 genes, but what do they actually do inside the human brain? Well, when scientists dug into the biological identity of these 163 genes, a really clear picture emerged. These genes are highly expressed in neurons, they're heavily linked to synaptic transmission, and they primarily encode for ion channels and neurotransmitter transport. To put it simply, these genes act as the critical hardware. They're literally the blueprints for building the neural synapses and ion channels that are absolutely necessary to fire off those memory-making electrical signals.
And this brilliantly illustrates something even more profound. These genes aren't just responsible for generic, everyday bodily functions. No, they are hyper-specifically enriched for excitatory neurons in the brain. But even more unexpectedly, they are strongly linked to major cognitive disorders.
In fact, the genetic variants tied to these memory encoding waves are enriched for neurodevelopmental disorders. Things like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, bipolar disorder, and major depressive disorder. This is just a massive, fascinating discovery. It strongly suggests that the very same genetic networks responsible for successfully encoding a memory might also be the networks disrupted in these conditions. It really helps explain why working memory deficits are sometimes seen in patients with ADHD or autism, and it completely shifts how we understand these disorders. But as any good skeptical scientist would ask, are these genes actually specific to memory, or is this just the brain's general everyday network for thinking and focusing? To prove that these 163 genes are truly special, the researchers ran a brilliant control analysis.
So, the crucial point is, remember that math distractor task the patients had to do? Well, researchers checked the electrical activity and gene expression for that task too. They found 210 genes correlated with doing math, but the contrast is massive. The math genes were non-neuronal, they had zero links to cognitive disorders, and out of all those genes, only 27 overlapped with our memory genes. This absolutely proves that those 163 memory genes form a unique, isolated biological network dedicated specifically to forming memories.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the future of memory, repairing the hardware. All of this data is amazing, right? But why does identifying these specific genetic targets actually matter for the real world? Well, it matters because it gives modern medicine a literal roadmap. Take the GRIC4 gene, for example. This is one of the specific target genes they identified. It encodes a specific receptor in the brain, it correlates with beta waves, and it's linked to both autism and schizophrenia. Because scientists now know this highly specific piece of hardware is tied to memory waves, they finally have a concrete target to investigate when things go wrong. In fact, the source study explicitly points out, and I quote, "Pharmacological agents with preferential activity for this receptor may be helpful for treating cognitive problems in these patient populations." Basically, by knowing exactly which genes control memory waves, researchers can finally stop guessing. They can start designing highly targeted, specific drugs to treat debilitating memory and cognitive disorders. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. If we now know the genetic hardware of memory, and we can clearly map how it translates into the electrical software of our minds, how long until we can actually repair it when it breaks? The bridge between DNA and brainwaves has finally been crossed. I really hope this explainer sheds some light on the incredible mechanics happening inside your head right now as you commit these very facts to memory.